Good morning, everyone. I'm Andrea, and welcome. Thank you for being here this morning. And I am so excited to have Carrianne Leung here. Carrianne is my friend and colleague and comrade. We went to grad school together, and I'm just really excited about her work as a writer, her work as a sociologist, her work in community. Carrianne was quite involved and led the writing of the report on SARS. And Carianne has been incredibly involved in issues of equity in the area of writing and BIPOC writing in Canada. So her bio goes like this. Carrianne Leung is a fiction writer and educator. She holds a Ph.D. in Sociology and Equity Studies from OISE UT. Wondrous Woo was shortlisted for the 2014 Toronto Book Awards. Her collection of linked stories, That Time I Loved You, was released in 2018 by Harper Collins and released in the US by Lighter Wright W.W. Norton in 2019. That Time I Loved You was also shortlisted for the Toronto Book Awards, recently longlisted for Canada Reads in 2019, and was considered one of the best fiction titles of 2018 by CBC Books. Her work also appeared in The Puritan, Rice Paper, The Globe and Mail, Room Magazine, Prairie Fire, and Open Book Ontario. Carianne is also, Carianne, are you still a writer in residence at U of T? Or is that completed?
That was 2 residencies ago.
Okay.
And now I'm the distinguished visitor at University College at U of T.
Thank you very much. So today, Carianne will lead a discussion / workshop on called Writing in Dangerous Times, Call and Response. So I'm going to turn it over to Carianne. And once again, thank you all for being here, and thanks for accepting the invitation, Carianne.
Thank you so much for sharing space with me. I've never done a Zoom workshop before, so bear with me. It's nice to see your faces. I'm going to start. When I was thinking about what I would do for this session, I thought of using a paper that I wrote last year as a way to engage in conversation. Something that I've never done before. I write my pieces, I send them out, but rarely do I get this kind of engagement. And I hope that we can animate the essay and the things that I want to talk about in this session. So I'm going to refer to my notes a lot, so don't think I'm just looking down for no particular reason. So as a writer, I see everything is story. And of course, stories are present in other modes beside from written text or oral storytelling. It is in fact present in every act of our making. Story is the most basic unit for us in making meaning as humans. We can't live without them. They inform who we think we are, our belonging, our memberships, what we do, how to proceed. So we create them, we share them, we change them around, we retell them in different ways to understand, we believe in them, and we also challenge them. Stories are not inherently right or wrong, true or false. As a writer, I am highly conscious of the narrative choices that I make to tell them. They can surface things that are hidden, they can bring new possibilities, but they can also invoke more terror. We are living in a moment when we need to be very attentive to and intentional about the stories we make and the stories we consume and claim. So in using story and narrative in my writing, I want to help us think through this moment, including how to keep ourselves as healthy as we can with as much care to ourselves and each other. I was asked last year to give a keynote speech in Fredericton at a lit festival. And I was asked at a time when my own writing came to a standstill. I was trying to absorb a historical present that I could only name as a dangerous time. So the questions that I asked myself in writing this essay were, what is my duty as a writer? What stories do we need right now? What do we need to archive for the future? And what is the future? And I was especially struck in the context of a paper I read yesterday by David Theo Goldberg, who wrote The Futureless Future and The Stolen Tomorrow. So that is very much the context in which I am speaking with you. So writing this paper took many, many months, and I decided to use it today as a frame for our session. I will read excerpts from the paper, and I will pose questions at the beginning of the segments and at the end of the segments, and I'm going to ask you to respond to it. So I will pause for about 5 minutes after reading an excerpt for you to make notes. And you don't have to share these notes. These are for yourself, and they could be in words, they can be in sketch, they can be in any way that you feel you want to respond. So I just ask that you have some writing utensil and paper or whatever medium you use with you. So when I go through the paper, I will read, which is my call, and I will expect you to have a response. And at the end of the session, we're going to break into smaller groups so that you can talk a little bit about what the content of my paper surfaced for you. And then we'll come back together as a larger group. So the paper is entitled Writing in a Dangerous Time. It's published online, as well as it's going to come out in print form in an anthology called Watch Your Head. So the first question is, where are we in this storm? My social media feeds have been filled with photos of bees, bees on flowers, bees in a ballet of flight, bees on bees. My friends are obsessed with bees. In the context of the complexities and catastrophes facing us, of course we are obsessed with bees. Simultaneous to the appearance of bees on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, I keep trying to write, but it's not going well. We writers know the power of the flow, that magical place where words pour from us like soft water. We intuitively feel for that surge that is from us, but not quite of us. This is the part of the process of writing that makes our work so enlivening and occasionally terrifying. But when the words and stories do not flow, when we are caught in low tide, when floundering, I have been floundering. There is no magic to be found lately. Icebergs are melting, fire is setting the world alight, 50% of our biodiversity has been lost. The scale of human suffering is insurmountable. Hate crimes, police brutality, incarcerated children, state terrorism, missing and murdered women, over-policed bodies, bodies floating on water, bodies crying, bodies rising. We look for bees in our state of seeming helplessness, with the sole duty to not look away. What do I write? I don't know, and I don't think this will offer any answers, but I hope it gives us a space to think about, talk about, write towards something. Perhaps this talk is not even about writing. It may be more about being human, existing in this precipice of something else, some deep transformation as our world is also transforming. So I'll ask you right now with this prompt to write. Where are you in these times? What is your story? I'll give you 5 minutes and I'll let you know when it's up. Okay, you have 1 minute left. Twenty seconds. So finish off that sentence if you were writing a sentence. And stop. So the framing of the next session is, what is our story and what is its becoming? I started writing this paper in the spring. The days were growing warmer, the leaves on the trees burst into my favorite hues of fresh green. Flowers reemerged like sleeping beauties. Unlike my usual joy at greeting this season, I wondered what I did to deserve this wonder. One day as I was walking, a monarch butterfly flew close, crossing my path. I stopped to give it the right of way, and it fluttered in that zigzag way that butterflies do. I wanted to apologize for not having given full attention to their fierce tenacity enough in my lifetime. I wish that I had paid better attention. Do butterflies know how beautiful they are to us? Do we know how beautiful we can be to each other? We know that a writer needs to attend to the world, and I do, but I do so lately with an intensity that can only be described as a last gasp, as if all this will fall away like illusion at any moment, and I must remember to record it properly. I don't have the discerning eyes of a scientist who can perhaps detect the smallest evidence of our unraveling. I only have the eyes of a writer who seeks beauty, humanity, and life, even in scenes of death. Everything looks deeply sacred to me now. Trees, birds, strangers' faces. There is an illumination to everything. Is this what mourning looks like? I am full of grief and fear and wonder. What are we really looking for? Who are we becoming in this looking? There are other things happening. My child turns 12 and starts middle school and is worried if they will have friends. My parents grow frail but attempt to be more kind. Some friends have just had babies, and I have to remember that babies are still being born. Who am I to despair? I am in the middle of life, a really good life that I may or may not deserve. I need to be called back to the minutiae of the everyday. This is my predicament of being a writer in a dangerous time. The simultaneity of life and death on scales big and small as I search for what stories to tell. What is to be said at this time? What is to be awakened? What essential truth is there to hold? I am only a storyteller, and all I've ever known has been that stories are necessary. So my question to you for this part of the writing, I am a storyteller. Who are you? What stories do you need to tell? And I'll give you another 5 minutes. You have 1 minute left. Ten seconds. And stop. Does 5 minutes feel about right to everybody? Is that good? Okay, awesome. All right, so my question for this next part, what does it mean to be human? I tell my writing students, everything you write is about what it means to be human. Even if your characters are aliens, teenage vampires, cats, you are writing about humanity. Stories have always been my instruction manual on being human. When I first immigrated to Canada as a child, I learned English because I loved to read fiction. It wasn't a compulsion to communicate, but a compulsion to understand and a need to be reflected. One writer in particular, Jean Little, wrote of lonely children, children in pain, children growing up despite this loneliness and pain. I appreciated her so much because it was told against all the other narratives of childhood where I could not locate myself. I was in awe. How did this writer have this profound understanding of my feelings? How did she reach out from the page to remind me that I am part of a human family, not monstrous, not other, but just a child? I suppose this is the quest that I am on in writing this. I am seeking to know that I am not alone, and I am seeking to understand this pain and to put language like a salve upon it. And it's not just of suffering, but of putting the words to our complicated joy too. We mustn't forget about joy. We will need to reimagine what this means, reimagine what a good life is by other metrics. So my question is, what is the story of being human? Who told it to you? How are we showing ourselves in our full humanity? So I'll give you another 5 minutes.
What was the last part of the question?
How are you and we showing ourselves in our full humanity? You have 1 minute left. Ten seconds. And stop. Here, other thing. Okay. All right. This next part, I'm going to start with the questions. How do we address the violence in our work? I can't turn away from the constant feed of evidence on my timeline or the news. I have tried to log off social media, not read. I do this because I do not know what to do in the face of so much violence. Every day there are fresh killings. Every day the news scream that we are in peril. I am so privileged that I can attempt to filter it out because my own safety is not as precarious as so many others. Those of friends, those of people I love, those strangers. The line from me to you, to them, to out there, to the bigger logic of things, these lines connecting all of us are becoming clearer. I am here only because others are there in harm's way. There is a suffering that comes in bearing witness to being unable to make it stop. We are not exempt, not safe, not innocent. There is no neutral place to exist or to write, but there never has been. In an interview with author Taya Lim with Booker Prize winner Marlon James, he stated that depictions of violence are gratuitous if we do not show its aftermath, its suffering, and also the survival. We seem to spectacularize violence. We know the brutality against Indigenous, Black, and Brown bodies and communities. We know the trauma of widespread sexual and gendered violence in our institutions, our communities, our homes. We know so much, and yet violence is pornographic if we go numb. Taya Lim responds to Marlon James and extends that perhaps the flip side of violence is tenderness and intimacy. And so perhaps then, this is the reach. So my question to you is, what is your reach?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that question again?
Sure. What is your reach? Or how do we address the violence in our own work? And indeed, what is the violence? Okay, 1 minute. Ten seconds. Okay, pens down. So the next question is, what haunts us? We are thick with ghosts that can be named and not named. The recent surfacing of consciousness that movements like #MeToo, Idle No More, and Black Lives Matter are giving shapes to these ghosts, showing the outlines of absences of the power that give form to our lives. It's not that gender violence, white settler colonialism, or anti-Blackness are recent events, but a trajectory of destruction that hides in policy, in rhetoric, in the everyday practices of ordinary people. It is not easy to write the delicacy of mundane violences, the artfulness of subjugation, the slow death drive of hate and greed. These effects and effects are not so easy to describe or to name, so we write the stories of these hauntings. What gets read, what gets published, what gains traction are important questions to consider. If dominant stories that are repeated like some kind of truth are no longer working, if the assumption about what is universal are proven untrue, then we need the counter stories, the haunted stories, the unburied stories. We need to clear space. Even in this moment when we face an uncertain future, or if we can't even imagine what the human future will be, we must create and continue to serve this archive. The archive is for the past and the future, but also for now. It is hard to be human. It is hard to be a writer. Tell this. Does this goal seem lofty? Maybe. Is it necessary? Yes. Is it a dangerous time? It is. There is more at stake than ever, but perhaps this has always been so. Everywhere throughout history, somebody has struggled for their lives and humanity, and somebody has picked up a pen, a paintbrush, used their voice to express this sorrow, this rage, and this insistence to life. So the question is, what are your ghost stories? What haunts your life, your family, your spaces, and your relations? You have 1 minute. Okay, you have 10 seconds. And stop. I hate interrupting your flow, but there'll be more time to write. The next question is, what does it mean to be together? We need audacity in order to rewrite the world. But what kind of audacity? A hero's journey? I am rethinking this metaphor and narrative. I am turning the central protagonist around so she can look at others, embrace them, engage, understand that she is born in a nest of relations and her heroism and courage is not a solo trek. Instead of being a good person or a good writer, I've started to think instead of fostering good relations. I count myself in the company of brilliant contemporary writers who are also wrestling with these same preoccupations. The ideas weave like conversations in our stories, poetry, and essays. There's a genealogy in our literary histories, and this genealogy makes all things possible, generating language that I can now hold and build. I believe our words are a commune also for readers. If we are dreaming the same dream, how miraculous, how incredible. Perhaps I've been hoping all along that I'm working towards the same dream or a path towards something that feels like love, like life, like justice, like the human. Writing possible futures must necessarily lead us back to relationship, and this includes non-human life forms. I have felt the need to slow things down, to walk at a snail's pace. On that encounter with the butterfly, I thought how strange that I offered a right of way to a butterfly. But isn't this so? Isn't this the most basic of things, the coterminous inhabitation of this space and time? Perhaps we can still retrieve and renew the possibilities of relationship that does not further harm, but can reimagine the relationship between a woman and a butterfly that would exceed my understanding of the world as I know it. I'll ask again, what audacity do we need now? I'll offer my answer, we need each other. So the questions for this part is, what is the story of our relationships in your work? How do relations figure in your process? 1 minute. You have 10 seconds. And stop. Okay, this is the last passage. And the question I begin with is, how will we sustain ourselves? During one sleepless night, while I waited for my child to be born, I learned that birth requires patience. I recalled it was bloody, full of pain, full of euphoria, utterly magic. And so now I think maybe patience is required for all kinds of birth, to write, to listen, to die. Even in death, there is a process of creation. And so even in this moment, I remember there needs to be patience. As I was finishing writing this paper, I read an article in the Washington Post by Dan Zak titled, "Everything is Not Going to Be Okay, How to Live with Constant Reminders That the Earth is in Trouble." He writes, "Hold the problem in your mind. Freak out, but don't put it down. Give it a quarter turn. See it like a scientist and as a poet, as a descendant and as an ancestor." So I will be slow and patient as I turn the problems in rotation and trust that the stories are coming. I want to ask you respectfully, gently, to not redirect your gaze from the wounds of this world. I would like your participation in this project of what it means to be human in our fullest form, and indeed to exceed the forms that we understand. With each other, whether that be in your writing, in your relations, in your sense of yourself, in the world, in your work. We have a special opportunity and responsibility ahead. How privileged are we, how brave, how open we are to be both the witness and the mirror. How lucky we are to be in a web of relations to everything. And also this, as much as the times we live are dire, we're also so fortunate to be the ones living it. It seems that we have some choices to make. It seems that we do this day by day, just as we will write it word by word. I think we can be afraid, but I think we also have courage. I extend my hand to you. I watch this butterfly cross, and I'll keep looking for bees. Sorry, my cuckoo clock is going. So the question is, what is our purpose in these times? How will you sustain life? You have 1 minute left. You have 10 seconds. Okay, stop. Thank you. Oh, thank you so much for all your engagement. I'm going to turn it back to Andrea now. I think she has something to say.
Thank you very much, Carianne. I just wanted to say, you know, I've read this piece several times, and it's got such a different affect hearing it being read by you. So I want to thank you for actually parsing it out in the way you did, and move us along. But what really, really struck me is, you know, this insistence in this piece around questions about what it means to be human, but the fragility of the human around, you know, this notion of floundering in that place of both knowing and unknowing as we try to be in relation.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that really struck me, and I know we're going to move into a moment that we will have some time to engage with this work, but what really struck me was this notion of writing as self and collective making. We come to make and shape who we are, the world the things around us through this process of writing. And writing, I also want to expand that in a way as well, in terms of what might constitute a writing, right, of the story. So that's the other thing. And this notion of, again, where care comes in, of being intentional, this notion of observation as one participates, but also seems to me, you know, this metaphor and this notion of the butterfly, there's a kind of, seems to me a kind of care and delicacy that has to come into being as we observe and as we participate. And it's in that kind of delicate space of observation and participation that something quite transformative can happen, as well as through this notion of bearing witness. And I'm really glad that we're talking about the pornography of the proliferation of images and words in the context of dangerous times. Kind of really reminded me, I'm not sure if you've read this essay, but I'm going to put it into what's out there. But Elizabeth Alexander wrote an essay right after the killing of Rodney King. And it's called Can You Be Black and Look at This? It's a really interesting essay that I think is really relevant today as well. I'll post this as well, as a way for us to think about what it means to look and what it means to bear witness, and the kind of chauvinism of the visual and sight in this notion of bearing witness, and how we might open up that space as to what constitutes bearing witness in dangerous times. But I would dare to say what constitutes witnessing as humans in the practice of being in relation. So this doesn't have to necessarily be in dangerous times, but as you ask the question, what it means, you know, and what is the reach, I think part of it is always bearing witness to, in a kind, with a kind of sense of radical empathy as we bear witness. So just wanted to sort of bring those strands together that really amplify some of the things I've been thinking about and some of my need to be in relation to with all of you folks here. I mean, it's the one thing I said when we introduced ourselves, that, you know, as you said, this is the time in which we need each other and we need to be in relation. So I just wanted to pull those strands back together in the context, and thank you for actually reading the piece.
Thank you for having me. So should we break into groups? And
that would be great if we could. So if we could get some assistance and some direction as to how to animate, how to move into our groups. Devi or Asha?
I can do this. Why don't I just do a random, I can do 2 breakout rooms. Did you want 2, Carianne?
Sure, depending, how many do we have? We have 13. I think if we can just keep it like this, I think, if that feels enough, like if that feels small and intimate enough to have conversation.
Sure.
Yeah? Andrea, what do you think? I think it's okay for 13.
I think it's okay for 13 if everyone participating feels fine with this large group, with a third group of 13. Is that a yes from everyone?
Sure.
Okay, so we'll remain in the large group. Thank you. So Carianne, I leave it up to you to, should we start with your first question? How would you like to animate this response component?
Well, maybe we can just start with just opening it up first in terms of things that you may want to share about what surfaced for you. And then if that feels like it leads into breaking down the questions, that would be great. So if anyone would like to just open up and say whatever you want to share. Or I can start with a question.
I'll share.
Okay.
So, you know, I'm going to just go, you know, it was really important for me and really interesting to talk about the ideas of stories and what stories do we write in the world. And I want to say that, you know, the other part of it that I'd like to sort of tease out as well is how do we, what was that question? What is your reach? I was really actually thinking about this notion of reach in terms of ideas of exclusion. So in terms of the work I do, being always mindful of who isn't there, but who isn't there based on not only their inability due to issues of access, right? Whether or not it's language, ability, physical ability. But the other thing that came as I was thinking through that question is this notion of the invitation. How do we bring people into relation with us? Is it as simple as inviting someone in, and whatever that looks like, into the frame for relations? So that's what I've been thinking about that deeply. And also, what does this invitation imply for us as we try to widen the circle? That's what I've been thinking through.
Thank you. Does that resonate with others in terms of what is the invitation and what is the reach in the work that you do?
It relates a little bit to what I was thinking about in that for that question too. Just it relates to just more specifically like institutions and how this idea of, I think there's a lot of institutions, sort of a lot of arts organizations scrambling now, especially with the pressures of social media and making statements of solidarity. But I see that the deep work that needs to happen, I think it relates to this idea of invitation. It's not just about inviting somebody into an organization, a person, BIPOC person. It's about how do really real change have to happen, and how do you make a space that is actually not just going to be harmful. And so I was thinking about the harm. I was thinking about the harm of the institutions that I have been part of and worked in, or currently maybe work in, that the institutions can be harmful and have been harmful. And that's what it made me think of. And so like, how do I function within that? And how do I not only recognize those things, but how can you reduce that? So that sort of brought up, those sorts of things came up for me in terms of the work of that particular section. So yeah, that's sort of, I think those are the factors these are the factors all around in the context for invitations, or of invitations in a way. I guess, Andrea, that's how I was relating to what you were conveying there. I think the hardest one, and I'm not even going to say what I wrote about yet, but I thought the most challenging one was the last one, like purpose, coming to purpose. And maybe it's because of the times we're in, but anyway, I'm not sure if anybody, that's all I'm going to say for now.
Yeah, for sure. I think that some of these questions are not meant to necessarily be answered. But again, it's the reach for them, right? Like, I have not been able to write. I still have not been able to write. And I continue to trust and have faith that the words will come, and we may not necessarily even have them formed yet, right? So that has been part of my process. So I've been stitching instead. Andrea told me to talk a bit about my stitching. I don't know. I am so thankful that this happened to me. In January, I randomly went into a fabric store and bought thread. I am not a handsy person. Like, words are good, but I can't like do things with these hands. So I thought. And since I started self-isolating, I just started playing with stitch. And I started just stitching things because I had no words. And I still needed to record this time. I still need to be able to tell it. So this was one of the first ones I stitched. I don't know if you can see very well. It's a typewriter and it says, "What story?" because the story wasn't coming. So I stitched it out into the universe. What story? What am I supposed to write? And then some of the other ones are just basically ridiculous. Like, I really miss noodles. So I stitched noodles. And it even has a C on the bowl just to make it clear it's my noodles. I stitched these lungs because I thought a lot about breath, especially in all of its iterations right now. So it's lungs. And then I also stitched, I guess last weekend, I stitched a police car burning. I just stitched this for Andrea yesterday, and it's Northern Lights, which I've never seen before, and I've always wanted to, and I'm not sure if I'll ever be able to in this life, but I'm happy that they exist and they're there. So for us not to have words or whatever it is, the blocks in which we all have in our making and our creating, I feel like is only one mode of address, right? That we have lots of ways in which we are able to document our lives and to do that reach. And that could take many forms. I got to show and tell my stitching. So now you tell me more about what you're going through and some of your answers to the questions or whatever this has brought up for you. Yes, Cassandra.
Something, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, fantastic. Something I've been kind of preoccupied with is just the limits of communication, the limits of language, trying to kind of emotionally digest what's been happening and realizing that the form of writing that I usually take just isn't cutting it. It was almost devaluing the experience and not kind of getting at like the nuance of, you know, what I was feeling, what I was witnessing. It wasn't just expressing the degree of outrage and like just this collective feeling of just hypocrisy and rage and like grief, and also communicating my positionality for feeling those things. So I've been really trying to kind of like your stitching, kind of in a way of just like completely trying to adopt or find a new form of communication. So whether that's like, you know, fiction or poetry, I usually take the very social scientist method of like, Andrea can probably, she's read my work, like breaking things down to the nth degree, proving a point when I realize this, you know, as you said, Andrea, there's this place of knowing and not knowing, and this place and where we're kind of trying to define a method of finding relations, if we can, of inviting people in, and it's like finding language and going there. It's going to take some stretching, and I actually found adopting new forms of expression like poetry was unbelievably effective. Mm-hmm. And yeah, like I'm hoping to share it with the residency. Hopefully I'll have everything done by then, but I'm sure I'll just share it with you guys later. But yeah, this was extremely helpful, and I just wanted to share that, and I got some good ideas down. But yeah, I'm gonna stop talking and give someone else the time to speak.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. Anyone else want to? Yes, Priscilla.
All right, hi. So my actual work centers around storytelling, so this was great for me. So I was thinking a lot about these things before, because I'm not actually sure like exactly how to connect storytelling and care until I like thought about it through the residency. So a lot of things that you were talking about, I've been kind of addressing it in my artwork as well as in my research. So basically, like, how do we deal with like relations? How do we deal with, let's see, like our ghosts, and what did I write up here with their, like how do we address the violence and things, because I can't physically go on social media without being bombarded, and I just feel really like, so I want to talk about it, but I don't want to talk about it because then I get attacked for it, that sort of thing. So I've been trying to figure out ways to cope with that and find ways to actually, as well as care and think about care for myself. And it's been very difficult, I will say. But I do really like how you talked about humans and humanity and nature in this thing, because it's how we perceive stories, and that's one way of looking at it. And my work usually centers around Walter Benjamin's storytelling. So for the final question, I was thinking a lot about like experience and how we can just live through this time and then be able to retell it. And it doesn't really matter what we do right now, we just how we just kind of live it, and then we can retell it and learn from it.
Yes. Yes. And for me, that's the reach, and that's the stitching, and watching butterflies, like all of those things are moving me through the days. And I trust that that I will find the stories and they will come. You know, this may not be the time. I think lots of ways in which we have conventionally been communicating are failing right now because it is just so immense and complicated, right? So, yeah. Thank you.
Hello?
Yes.
Hi. Okay, sorry, there's something wrong with my camera, but it's very intriguing. Thank you so much for this. This has honestly been really, really moving for me, but I just wanted to share based on what was just discussed, because I did walk into this residency hoping to explore stories we're going to tell of such global turbulent times, because I think that with this pandemic, people have been going through their own, nightmares, but this was the shared nightmare that we all got to live together. It's different at every shore, but it's still a nightmare the whole world lived together. And as I'm observing on social media, all the projects and the expressions that have been going on, it's interesting to see how old groups and old people from back in the time are instigating pages that are sharing old photos and old and memories and whatnot, and it's through that sharing that everyone is doing right now. Probably they're doing it for healing, but it's more or less, it just struck me the other day on that group that it's almost like people are trying to remember who they were. And they're going back to be able to tell their story or figure out their story so that they know how they will be moving on from here. But it just it really struck me as people were sharing all those 20 years old picture for them, or their graduation, or remembering things that they used to do with friends, and I just it always or it's making me feel, are we trying, is that it, is are people just trying to figure out who they were because we were also consumed with life? These are just things and thoughts that come to mind, and it's beautiful to watch. It's not always it's sometimes painful because some people go through difficult memories and bring up difficult memories, but it's almost the same idea or the metaphor as the butterfly that we talked about. It's just this whole transformation, and I wonder if this period of time is supposed to be that cocoon that we all need to be kind of focusing on. Thanks again. Thank you.
Thank you, Rania. Thanks for sharing that. Anyone else have any observations about this moment?
Comment on Rania's thoughts there. Thank you for it. I mean, it was very interesting to me as well for us to, I mean, in relation to some of the things we're thinking about the trace that one might leave through the creation of the story and the telling of the story. I mean, I see it related, Rania, in a certain way of people looking back at these archives, because these are, I think these photographs are really also personal archives that people perhaps now have the time to engage with, as you say. But now that we're in this space, it seems that there's also these 20-year-old archives. There's something about physicality. There's something about something that's material that it brings up for me as well, that people are going back and they're engaging with these objects in a moment when most of our lives are being mitigated through the digital, right? So there's something about holding these things called a photograph. There's something about going back and being in touch with a certain kind of materiality of life in a moment when the kinds of relations we're used to, this face-to-face exchange of physical energy in the world, whether or not it's with nature or with each other, has been, there's been a bit of a shift in that. So there's something about, like I say, those physical objects that I think might have a deeper meaning in terms of our real desire for the real.
I think Ray, I'm sorry, it says Ray Master Jen. You have to turn your mic on though. Okay.
Yeah, my name is my name is actually Jenny. My middle name is Ray, and my last name is McMaster, so that's how I get Ray Master Jen. I am primarily a visual artist, but I used to do a lot more writing when I was younger, and I do like to come back to it sometimes. And part of the reason I don't write as much now is as I'm so much more aware of there being multiple ways of looking at things and multiple possible interpretations and narratives, whereas when I was younger it seemed much easier to just sort of find this direction and opinion. And so it's been an interesting discussion about just sort of how to try to bring, it brings up ideas of like, how do you incorporate multiple perspectives, or if you are trying to recount some troubling narrative in your past, and being very aware there being multiple ways of looking at it. And I think that's often what stops me from writing, and you can kind of get lost while you're trying to recount it. I don't know, it's sort of about trying to find a way through that, trying to find a way of recognizing the multiple ways of looking at it without getting stuck. Yeah.
As a writer, there are lots of ways in which I think about those questions, and some ways in which I address those things. As a fiction writer, we have a thing called POV, point of view, right? And so there are writers who have been playing with point of view, and how do you look at those multiple perspectives at one event, right? So there are lots of ways in which that happens within writing, and I'm sure it happens in all other modes of making and creating and in visual arts. The other thing I want to talk about, though, is that if we are serious about creating and reaching for our relations, we have to let go of the idea that we are going to master a particular kind of knowledge, right? That we have to release the idea that what we are going to create is a definitive of anything at all, that we are actually creating in an archive with others. And I think that that's a really important thing to keep in mind. So when I feel like as a writer, I don't write, it's not a solo project. I write in a community of other people who are writing, creating, producing culture and knowledge in ways that is in concert with something about this moment, right? So, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I really appreciate the role of butterflies and bees in the text you read today. Just wanted to say that.
Oh, thank you.
Really important.
I really appreciate the role of blueberries in your work.
Oh,
I wonder if I could pick up on that. this idea of, that came up early actually with both Andrea and Lisa, and this idea of invitation. But first, Carianne, thank you for this. This has been such a deep exploration and a very intimate one, and I felt a need for this, so it was really cathartic. Not just cathartic, it was a useful space to be in, to be able to share ideas. I love the kind of whiteboard that Trevi set up. We could see what people are talking about, thinking about. But this notion of invitation is interesting, and one of the things we did at the start, Trevi now this had set up these circles with the empty chair. Something that we talked about the previous year with one of the classes we were doing, where to ensure that we're always very well aware that there are absences in our midst, and that they're often of our own creation. We have to be conscious of that to see that. The notion of invitation is interesting because back in the day, of course, all these artist centers and all were saying, well, we're wide open, you know, all sorts of, you know, Indigenous folks, people of color can come in. It's open to them, right? But of course, there wasn't an invitation. It was just a sense that the door is open and do you walk through that door? And I just got off had a meeting with our new president coming in, Anna Serrano, who's, of course, she's going to be the first woman of color as president of an art and design school in Canada. And one of the first things she did, and it was great to see this coming from her level, is to say, how do we reach out to, say, your grad students as BIPOC students, inviting them to say, this is a place where you can come and actually situate yourself and do the work you're planning on doing, right? So I think these things are all very important, both in our creative practice, but and it comes back to something I've been thinking about, a notion of self, and how we, in a sense, have to be wary of you know, that Western dualistic notion of a preeminence of self, which says that my I is so important, and it gives rise to things like what we're seeing in very disturbing ways, sort of nationalist notions of individuality. You know, how do we actually make an open invitation to bring in notions of difference that are outside of our scope of imagination too? So these are all things that I've been thinking about through this amazing workshop and the connections here. So thanks for letting me chat on that.
Thank you, Ashok. Thank you for that. And that is what I also was trying to address when I talked about the hero's journey, which is a very, very common trope in all fiction, right? Because you follow a protagonist, they go through things, usually hardships, and then they reemerge transcended in some way. And that is the notion of the self. I think that is something that I am trying to break and expand and reach for possibilities of within my own work as a writer. That there are other ways of telling stories and telling the self. Yeah.
So this is Andrea again. Thank you so much, Carianne. I also, you know, going back to this idea around the absences in our midst, around collective self-making, that our creative processes can allow us to develop. You know, I think part of what you've been also putting out to us is this notion, I think, of our collective, the need to collectively bear witness at all times. The other thing, as you were talking, Ashok, about the invitation, I mean, the invitations being intentional with a purpose, with allowing those who are invited in to be able to participate based on their own sense of their humanities as well, which I think is really important. The other thing that I am also thinking about, sometimes I chuckle about it, is this notion again of the invitation and what happens, much like the movie, what happens when one opens a door and intentionally invites someone in and they decide not to leave. How do we work with that? Because these are real possibilities and we might want people to stay, but also we have to be open, as you say, you know, Ashok, we have to be open for those other folks who might come in who we can't even imagine yet. We also have to be open to the fact that they might not want to go back to their own homes. What are we going to do with them then? I think, and we should think about those questions. So again, I am wondering if anyone else has anything else to say. It's now 12:29, and this has been also important grounding for me to be with you all and to have Carianne facilitate this discussion. But if there's nothing else to say in this format, then I think we could take leave of each other. But I would like to say that this is an ongoing process, that these prompts were meant to get us to think about where we're at, to think about where the rest of the world and our relationships and relations in the rest of the world reside. And so as we end this workshop and this discussion, I want to encourage you all to continue to think about these questions. And I think a big question here for me is that of the haunting. What haunts us? What are the ghosts we need to actually be in relation with? How do we work with that haunting and allow that haunting to allow us to do something that's productive in the present and in the future? And you know, a number of us has, I mean, the hauntings are huge and they go very deep in our histories. So again, the work is ongoing, the work never ends in terms of what we're talking about. So any other comments before we wrap? No. Thank you very, very, very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It was such an honor. Yay.
Yay.
Yay. Have a wonderful day.
Very much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I don't want to leave.
Thank you, Carianne.
Hi, Dana.
Hey.
Just going to read these.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Good to be writing again.
Good. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to leave now. Bye.